So it's great to be back here at the City of Light Spiritualist Church, and so much love for all of you guys. And today I thought, since next Sunday is Easter Sunday, the day that's marked with bunny rabbits and colored eggs and candy and butter lambs and rejoicing the rebirth of spring. And it's also this kind of annual spiritual mindset day for people. Maybe even if you're not Christian, there's the study of the Christ consciousness that starts to take hold during this special time as it marks the resurrection of Jesus and the rising from the dead. And that's something that over the years I've really enjoyed studying, the Jesus story and his path as a medium, as a healer, and as a spiritual teacher. So today I'm focusing on that spirit contact and the spiritual unfoldment surrounding that Easter story, surrounding Jesus. And I remember in classes with Patricia Price, as one of my mentors, she would talk about Jesus and the importance of certain things from the Bible as it relates to spiritualism and mediumship. So I'd like to start there. And I actually think we need to start with a time just before the transfiguration of Jesus, because Jesus had started his 3-year ministry, and he was traveling with his disciples and healing people, which is really cool because, you know, as spiritual healers, people who are spiritualists, that's something of great interest to us. And of course, lecturing. And we get to that point when Jesus has fed 5,000 people. Wow. 5,000 people with only 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. You know, I am always impressed. My mother can pull things out of the cupboard and make a meal fit for a king. But I have to be impressed with Jesus and his chefness in this instance, for sure. And then, of course, there's the whole walking on water thing. And I'm tempted sometimes to try it out on Casadega Lake here in Lilydale. Would it work? It's pretty shallow, at least in when you first begin to swim at the beach. But the times I've been able to walk on water, it has been winter and there has been ice on the lake. So he's impressive. But I want to take us to a place where he's raising up Lazarus from the dead, and just take a pause and kind of flex into that story of Lazarus briefly. I don't know how familiar you all are with this story, but it's really interesting because Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. 4 days. And Jesus goes to his tomb. Everybody's been begging him. Jesus, you know, all these people are saying, please go help Lazarus. And he shows up and he's at the tomb and he tells them to take away the stone. And the sister of Lazarus, who is dead, Martha, says to Jesus, Lord, by this time there is a stench, for he's been dead for 4 days. And Jesus says to her, did I not say to you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God? And then they took the stone from the place where the dead man was lying, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and he said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. And I know that you always hear me. But because of the people who are standing by, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me. Really powerful words. I just have to pause with that, because isn't it interesting? Sometimes we have to say things externally rather than internally for us to believe them, almost to witness our own voice saying them, or even taking part in a group worship such as today with church. There's that recognition that we have this witness of what's going on spiritually for ourselves, with the healing that can come in those moments. And there's such a beautiful prayer that Amy was sharing, you know, the understanding of how that perfect sense of ourselves is always present, but we forget it sometimes, and we need that conscious reminder. So anyway, I need to go forward in the story here. Now, when he said these things, you know, so that they can believe, he cries out in a loud voice and he says, Lazarus, come forth. And he who had died came out bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, loose him and let him go. Now, in that moment, Jesus is calling upon a higher power. Jesus is calling upon the divine, and he's calling it into that person of Lazarus. And it's that understanding that this is where he should be. That is where his perfection would be, to be within. And throughout the story, which is so fascinating in the healing stories of Jesus, is he was able to reaffirm for other people what their perfection was, their wholeness, their completeness. And that is something that we can totally get on board with as spiritualists, because that's what we are doing, holding the space for a person, allowing the divine to channel through us to them, to help them with upliftment and in that moment of need. So I really do feel that that was kind of just a little light practice for Jesus before the ultimate example of rising from his own tomb. but in another sense, it is Lazarus's resurrection that's going to lead to Jesus's own death. It's one of the factors, because the local establishment doesn't like it, and it's yet another reason for them to imprison, hate, or ridicule him. And so there's this understanding of, I do this, but it brings about my own, that is part of this merging, this understanding of what's going on. I'll tell you, the spiritual symbology, it's just so rich throughout the story. But I'm going to explain a little bit more why we're focusing on that a bit later. So now we're at that point that after Peter has declared Jesus the Messiah, Jesus predicts his own death for the first time. His disciples, and they're confused. They really don't know how to take this. You know, Jesus says a lot of things they don't quite understand. They have glimmerings of understanding, but they don't understand fully, and until, you know, the big ending, as it were, the finale that's about to come forward here. So Jesus goes off to pray and meditate again. That's a frequent thing. Isn't it beautiful that it's actually in the Bible, that he would go and pray and meditate, and that was something he did to restore himself. That is something that we encourage as spiritualists, for people to reach that God within themselves, to take those quiet moments, even in our church service today, to take those quiet moments and to reset ourselves in alignment consciously with the divine. It's so very beautiful. So the Transfiguration is what I want to get to, and that is considered one of the miracles of Jesus in the Gospels. And it's unique. It's unique because the miracle happened to Jesus himself. There he is making all these miracles for everybody else. But this is something that happens to Jesus himself. And Thomas Aquinas considers that the Transfiguration is the greatest miracle. It is one of the 5 major milestones in the life of Jesus. You have the others being baptism, crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. A lot of things in between that, but those are the majors, right? And in 2002, Pope John Paul II introduced the Luminous Mysteries in the Rosary practice, which includes the Transfiguration, also known as the desire of holiness. Isn't that interesting? The desire of holiness. There's that point where we're understanding that we desire to be holy ourselves. That desire of holiness, a recognition of the desire and that we are at the same time. The subjective, the objective, and the omnijective is all present within that. So the Pope did this in order to make Transfiguration accessible to people for their own journey. What happened at the Transfiguration of Jesus? Let's set that scene. Jesus goes to a mountain, later referred to as the Mount of Transfiguration, to pray. And he takes with him 3 of his disciples. He has Peter, James, and John. So those are who have joined him on the mountain. And once at the top, a mystical experience occurs. And it would later be referred to in the Greek Orthodoxy, the Church of the Greek Orthodox, as the metamorphosis, right? The metamorphosis, the transfiguration. You know, as spiritualists, when we think of transfiguration during spirit contact, it's because the face of another person has come as almost like a veil across the other person's face. But this is a different sort. This is transfiguration in the terms of metamorphosis. So on that mountain, Jesus begins to shine with bright rays of light, like beaming it everywhere. It's that amazing moment. And in Matthew 17, it states that Jesus was transfigured before them, his face shining as the sun, and his garments became white as the light. Now, the book of Luke is very specific. It describes Jesus in a state of glory. And in Luke 9, you see, they saw his glory. They saw his glory. So one can only imagine the vibratory state that Jesus was in. So when people go into that raising of vibration, there is a vibratory change that can move, can shift and move. And when people are reaching to maintain that state, you may see that when they're meditating, when they are doing spiritual healing, when they're doing mediumship, when they're just being with people that they love. There are moments where we can feel that change, the edges of light and space and glory. Who here has felt that at some moments, those incredible energetic connections that we make in those moments when we recognize our own soul is going through a metamorphosis. So then Peter says, "You are the Christ." And that is stated in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it would seem that Jesus is preparing himself vibrationally for divine connection. His etheric body and aura are expanded and radiant. When you study about the aura, the layers of the aura, vibratory states, you can almost see the radiance. And that is what artists have tried to depict in beautiful paintings of Jesus, and to help us to understand that radiance is there for us as well. Patricia was always so beautiful as a teacher to explain that was something that we can ascend to ourselves and touch and reach to in those moments. Now, as he's doing this, the Old Testament figures of Moses and Elijah, they appear and they're right next to Jesus, and Jesus speaks with them. Spirit contact, anyone? We have spirit contact. We've made contact. The big guys have arrived. And these figures represent the law and the prophets, respectively. And they spoke of Jesus's exodus or departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. And it seems to be a spiritual consultation with the two entities known as these prominent religious figures of the past. Moses tends to be more well-known. I mean, when you free a people from Egypt and, part the Red Sea and go up on a mountain yourself and bring down some 10 commandments, you tend to get remembered. Well, Elijah, he is definitely someone who is very well respected as a prophet himself, and did go in the sense of being taken directly to heaven, is what the scriptures say about these things. So it's really interesting that they show up during this moment, and that transfiguration also echoes the teachings of Jesus, that God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And although Moses had died, and as I said, Elijah had been taken up to heaven centuries before, they continue to live, implying that the same return to life applies to all who face death and have faith. That is something that as spiritualists we can also get on board with. There are those gifts of mediumship. We know there's no true death. that the soul releases from the physical body and has continuity of life. And we are part of the living spirit always. Eventually, Elijah and Moses begin to depart from the scene. And Peter begins to ask Jesus if the disciples should make 3 tents for him and the 2 prophets. I think he wants it to last a little longer. And this is often interpreted as Peter's attempt to keep the prophets there. You know, I guess there's that moment in my mind of the humor kicks in a little bit, and it's a little bit of like the HGTV moment of, and let's plant a house here and we'll decorate it like this and we'll live on this mountain. This is that moment of he wants to just stay there. He's caught up in the event and he's expressing a desire to stay on the moment of the mountain, to soak it up. And this is the pinnacle of all religious experience for him, this understanding of the promised land. And who wouldn't desire to stay in that moment? We understand this desire to choose that Mount of Transfiguration over everyday life, and especially over the path to, you know, Good Friday and crucifixion that's going to be happening. Who wouldn't prefer to avoid the inevitable conflict and build a dwelling place on the mountain, especially if you've been an eyewitness to magnificence? But before Peter can finish, a bright cloud appears. And some of you may know what happens next. A voice from the cloud states, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." And this voice is, of course, assumed to be God, similar to when God showed up when Jesus was baptized at the River Jordan. So you have all of these connections of divine understanding. And the disciples, of course, they fall into the ground in fear. They're like, oh my gosh, God's voice is showing up. And there's some strange happenings here. Whew. And Jesus approaches and he touches them and he tells them, don't be afraid. And when the disciples look up, they no longer see Elijah or Moses. Whew. I get excited about this stuff because when you go in this path of spiritual understanding, it's one of those moments where you love to tell the story because you feel closer to it in the moments that you do. And it's easier for you to recognize some pivotal moments for yourself if you can look back, or you know what to reach to in the future and beyond. So when Jesus and the 3 apostles, they're then going back down the mountain. And Jesus tells them not to tell anyone. Don't tell anyone the things that you have seen until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. So the apostles are described as questioning among themselves as to what Jesus meant by risen from the dead. You know, there's a sense of what's he really talking about? Just you wait, right? Just you wait. So later on, the transfiguration of Jesus was seen as this example to others. People who have studied this is, as I said, others to transform, to believe, to mirror the glory of the divine connection, the God, the goddess, the God of your own understanding, to move into that space. That transfiguration can be seen as a catalyst for processes which lead the spiritually seeking and faithful to the knowledge of God, and also to mystical experiences and an intense awareness of the presence of God. This transfiguration is a pivotal moment, and the setting on the mountain is presented as the point where human nature meets God, kind of like Michelangelo's creation of Adam moment on the Sistine Chapel, where the fingers are just in that moment of ready to meet. and is that meeting place of the temporal and the eternal, which Jesus himself is there as a connecting point for his disciples, acting as that bridge between the heaven and the earth, teaching them how they can do this for themselves. And in many ways, this event on the mountain is more for the disciples rather than Jesus. It's an interesting understanding that because they are firsthand witnesses to this transfiguration and to the meeting. And as disciples, they're given glimmers of the understanding, as I said, into those inner workings of spiritual and energetic principles. But as most of us do, they have only a partial understanding of the happenings of the ineffable, the undescribable, the infinite. This transfiguration was a spiritual experience, I feel, that was meant to strengthen their faith for the initiations into greater levels of consciousness and to bolster their faith for challenges that they would later endure. But it's only a temporary event. It's not meant to be permanent. As the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh states, it is not impermanence that makes us suffer. What makes us suffer is wanting things to be permanent when they are not. In the same way, at certain times in this life, God may give you special experiences of grace that strengthen your faith. We should welcome these experiences for the graces that they are. We shouldn't expect that particular experience to continue indefinitely, nor should we be afraid or resentful when that experience ceases. There's energy that carries forward. Now, they may have been meant only as momentary glimpses of the joy of heaven to sustain us as we face the challenges of this life, to help strengthen us on the road that will ultimately bring us into the infinite and endless joy of our heaven. The concept of the transfiguration of Jesus is considered a preview. It's an anticipation of the resurrection. Additionally, Jesus told his disciples in the prediction of his death that he would be killed, but on the third day he'd be raised from the dead. So now let's fast forward. We're going to fast forward in this story. We're going to go right past the feet washing, the Last Supper, the betrayal, the crucifixion of Jesus, and we're going to get to that resurrection. We're connecting those 2 points because we're focusing today on that spiritual contact and the ascended master portion. Now, Jesus is said to have made several spirit appearances in the days following his death. After all, he did tell his disciples he would be raised from the dead on the third day. And I'm not sure that they all believed him. So as the story goes, Mary Magdalene and 2 other women went to Jesus's tomb early on that Sunday morning, only to find that the stone had rolled away. And one of my absolute favorite Bible verses is Luke 24, 5-6, where the angel says to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but is risen." And I do find that to be the case. People don't, when they pass, just go hang out in the cemetery. They live beyond the so-called grave, as we know so well as spiritualists. And this is followed by Mary Magdalene running into Jesus himself. And then she goes back to the disciples. She tells them, "I've seen Jesus alive again, and we need to go to Galilee." She's all excited, I'm sure. And first, though, what do the disciples have to do? They have to run back to the tomb. They've got to make sure she's telling the truth. It's, so unbelievable, right? And in which she was telling the truth, but he's not there. His body is no longer present there. And that's when in Matthew 28, they say that those disciples went immediately to Galilee. And they did find Jesus there just as he said he would be. And a lot of scholars have speculated about this. They said that Jesus told them to go to Galilee because that was where most of his followers were. And that lines up with 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul describes this large gathering of disciples. It says, after that, he was seen by over 500 people at once. So it moves from the subjective experience into the objective experience by a whole group. And so that is, in terms of mediumship, that is what happens. A person may have a spiritual experience. They may have contact with a loved one in spirit, and they may tell someone, a friend or a family member, and they're like, that might not have really happened. Are you sure? Or whatever. They doubt the firsthand experience, just like the disciples doubted Mary Magdalene. And then we move into this objective experience when you've experienced it yourself, because personal experience trumps everything else, right? And so then you get this whole group experiencing it. And these amazing appearances, they are there in the Jesus story to show that he's alive again and that he's victoriously conquered the grave. In fact, it reminds me of so many of those stories from clients and from friends and family, and from myself, the experiences we've had with our loved ones, our spirit loved ones, when they're visiting and they're showing up as glimmers of light or smells or touches and sensations, perhaps noises or voices, and sometimes as full body manifestation. So in Luke 24, we read of two disciples traveling to a village called Emmaus, and it's this little town, and it's 7 miles away from Jerusalem. And my favorite Jesus connection one. They meet this man, and it's actually Jesus, but they don't know it. So sometimes we don't know who's with us until a little bit later down the road, right? So they walk and they talk with this man about the events of the crucifixion. They talk about about this resurrection idea until they reach town. And by then it's late afternoon, and the disciples ask him, stay for dinner. And they go inside, and when they got there, Jesus broke bread again, and he blessed it. And it's then that the disciples' eyes are opened, and they realize who the stranger is. And then in Luke 24, he vanished from their sight. So the disciples are left kind of shocked at by what they've experienced. And that's how it works with spirit contact sometimes, right? It's you get this recognition, the message, and then they're off again. And so it can be like that in our experiences. We can assume safely, I think, that immediately after Jesus appeared to the rest of the disciples, by the time it's evening and the disciples have gathered behind closed doors because they're afraid of the persecution of them. And then Jesus appears out of nowhere, right in their midst. And he says, peace be with you. And that's something that we have said in church. That's something that we recognize, that we send peace to another. Peace be with you. And he showed them his hands and his feet, and the disciples were overjoyed to see him. More identifiers. I've lost track of the number of times Spirit has shown me and shared the physical feelings of what their body experienced before passing. And they share this as proof of their identity, of their spirit. And so Jesus is showing disciples that's him. Now, as a side note, Jesus is considered this ascended master, this high vibrational enlightened being of love and light. And many of you know ascended masters are a group of spiritually enlightened beings who once lived as humans, and through their own work, their hard work, they cleared their karma, and in essence, they've achieved mastery. And for many people, they're on standby, waiting to share their profound wisdom on all aspects of spiritual and personal development. And usually ascended masters have this role and purpose of assisting humanity as a whole in our own ascension, and to increase our awareness of the spiritual forces that permeate the universe. So I just want to mention it as an educational opportunity for you. If you want to know more about connecting with ascended masters, such as Jesus and guardian angels and guides, and using this higher guidance, I encourage you to tune in, because on this week on Wednesdays with Willa, Patricia Price, our beautiful founder of the City of Light Spiritualist Church and a wonderful teacher of mine, is going to be my guest. That's our topic, so you can learn from her. So you can see that throughout this understanding of the points that I shared from the Jesus story, and we've focused on the spirit connection portion and that understanding of transcending death and moving into the continuity of life, understanding the process of the soul. And that's a main message of the Jesus story. And whether a person wants to consider it to be a supernatural vision or a real physical event, your own consciousness is going to show you the truth. So the big takeaways from today's lecture are that the divine God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. We continue to live. And through the gifts of mediumship, we know that there is no true death. The soul releases from the physical body and has continuity of life. We are part of the living spirit always. And as spiritualists, we're proving to others through our work, through our messages, that Jesus was right about transcending death, and that Buddha was right about transcending suffering, and that a regular person like you and me can communicate with the God of our own understanding. And we each can go to that Mount of Transfiguration in our own spiritual experiences and have a magnificent occasion with the divine, remembering those moments are for our own grace and transcendence over perceived suffering, wounding, and limits. And so when a person says, I've been to the mountaintop, there's a spiritual understanding to be attained through the experience, a recognition of the path ahead, of the divine calling. And in the week ahead, I hope that you take time to pray and to realize the divine connection in your own lives in beautiful, simple, or majestic ways, that within each of us is a spark of the divine, a conscious soul that's transcending life's mysteries and cosmically constructed for self-realization, healing, and trust in the journey. So like the beautiful hymns that we've sung together during this church service, may you today have peace like a river and rise and shine with the glory of God, transfiguring your light and life with the love of God. And I shall leave you with the final words that Jesus spoke to his disciples after his resurrection when he appeared out of nowhere. And I hope that you feel it in the depths of your being, and you carry it in your hearts, minds, and souls. Peace be with you. Thank you.